Nobody wanted this car. At least, not when it first appeared. It didn't attract attention. It didn't create excitement. And it definitely didn't make people stop and take a second look. Instead, it did something far more dangerous. It blended in. In a market filled with bold designs and aggressive marketing, this car chose a different path. It stayed quiet. Not boring, but not memorable either. And that was enough for people to ignore it. Because most buyers don't spend time thinking deeply about their choices. They react, they scroll, they compare quickly, they move on. And if something doesn't stand out immediately, it gets left behind. That's exactly what happened here. This car wasn't weak, it wasn't unreliable, it wasn't poorly designed. It simply didn't demand attention. And in a world where attention decides everything, that became its biggest problem. Dealers saw it first. Foot traffic around this model was low. Conversations were short. Test drives were rare. Sales teams tried to highlight its strengths. They talked about comfort. They explained how smooth it felt. They pointed out how well it handled daily use. But those things don't create excitement. They don't make people feel like they need to buy something right now. So interest stayed low. And when interest stays low, prices begin to change. At first, the adjustments were small, a slightly better deal, a temporary discount, an offer designed to create urgency. But buyers didn't respond. Because once doubt enters the conversation, it's hard to remove. People started asking questions. Why is it cheaper? Why isn't anyone buying it? Is there something wrong with it? And even without clear answers, those questions created a narrative. A quiet assumption that something about this car wasn't right. And that assumption spread. Not through facts, but through repetition. People heard it enough times that it started to feel true. So, they avoided it. They chose safer options. They followed what everyone else was doing. And slowly, this car disappeared from the spotlight. Not because it failed in a dramatic way, but because it never got a fair chance. However, that's only one side of the story. Because while most people ignored it, a smaller group noticed something different. They weren't chasing trends. They weren't influenced by popularity. They were paying attention to what the car actually offered. And what they saw surprised them. The car was consistent. It handled daily driving without problems. It didn't demand constant maintenance. It delivered a smooth, predictable experience. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, but everything dependable. And for these buyers, that mattered more than excitement. Because excitement fades, but reliability stays. They realized something most people missed. This car wasn't designed to impress quickly. It was designed to last. And because it wasn't popular, they could buy it for less, much less. So they did, quietly, without attention, without validation from others, just based on what they understood. And once they owned it, their experience didn't match the reputation. The car didn't break unexpectedly. It didn't create problems. It didn't justify the doubts surrounding it. Instead, it delivered exactly what it promised: consistency. That consistency built confidence, and confidence changes behavior. Because when owners trust something, they don't rush to replace it. They don't feel the need to sell it quickly. They keep it. And that's where the shift began. Because while the broader market continued ignoring this car, these owners were doing something important. They were holding on to it for longer than expected, which meant fewer units were returning to the market. At first, that didn't seem significant. Listings were still available, prices were still low, everything looked normal. But over time, that pattern started to matter. Fewer owners were selling, fewer clean examples were showing up, and the supply began to shrink. Slowly, almost invisibly, but consistently. And consistency creates change. Because when supply starts to drop, even slightly, it sets the stage for something bigger. At this point, most people still weren't paying attention. The car was still overlooked, still undervalued, still easy to ignore. But the conditions around it were no longer the same. Availability was changing. Options were becoming limited. And although demand hadn't increased yet, the balance was starting to shift. And once that balance begins to move, it doesn't stay hidden forever. Eventually, people noticed. Buyers who had ignored the car before started seeing something different. It wasn't as easy to find anymore. The best examples were disappearing. Listings were fewer. And that created curiosity. Because when something becomes harder to find, people start asking questions. Why is it disappearing? Why aren't people selling? Is there something I missed? Those questions lead to attention, and attention leads to discovery. Buyers began to realize something important. The people who owned these cars weren't in a hurry to let them go. They kept them, not because they had no choice, but because they were satisfied. The ownership experience was stable, predictable, free from constant issues. And over time, that consistency became visible, which slowly changed perception. At first, only slightly, then more clearly. The conversation shifted, from not worth considering to maybe there's something here. And once that shift begins, it grows. Demand starts to build, quietly at first, then with more confidence. And as demand increases, prices respond. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. Enough to make people notice, enough to change how the car is viewed. And that's the moment everything changes. Because once perception shifts, value follows. The same car that once felt invisible now feels limited. The same car that once had no demand now requires effort to find. And the same car people ignored now carries a different meaning. Opportunity. But here's the part most people miss. By the time something becomes obvious, the opportunity is already gone. Because markets don't wait. They move quietly. They reward early decisions, and they rarely give second chances. That's what makes this story so interesting. The car itself didn't change. Engineering stayed the same. The experience stayed the same. Only one thing changed: awareness. People finally noticed what was always there. And once that happens, there's no going back. Because now, it's not just a car. It's a missed opportunity. And missed opportunities always become valuable. So the next time you see something being ignored, don't dismiss it immediately. Look closer. Because sometimes, the things nobody wants today become the things everyone searches for tomorrow. And by the time you realize it, you're already too late.